Good evening and welcome to the British School and to the final lecture in our series accompanying the annual master's course in the topography and archaeology of the city of Rome. Our speaker tonight is Nigel Spivey, who is senior lecturer in classics at Cambridge University and a fellow of Emmanuel College. Nigel began his career as an Etruscologist, and much of his doctoral study of Etruscan black figure pottery was carried out in Italy, at Pisa University, and as Rome scholar here at the BSR. He's published extensively on ancient art, starting with the monographs Greek Art 1996, Etruscan Art for Thames and Hudson in 1997, and Greek Sculpture with CUP in 2013. His most recent book is The Sarpedon Krater, Life and Afterlife of a Greek Vase from 2018. Long before it became fashionable or obligatory for academics to make television programs, Nigel was something of a pioneer in the field, and his series How Art Made the World for the BBC in 2005 has also been published as a book. In tonight's lecture, which we're recording and with which our online viewers can engage using the Q&A panel on the screen, we'll hear something about his current work on narrative art. It depends upon your point of view, narrative and empathy in the reliefs of Trajans Column. Would you please welcome Nigel Spivey?
Can I start with a sentiment of in memoriam? Because Robert has alluded to the fact I was once here as a scholar, and when I was a scholar here at the BSR, the assistant director was Amanda Claridge, who died. It was taken from us earlier this month, and for those of you who never knew her, this will be a rather tantalizing thing to say, but it was really difficult to conceive of anyone knowing more about the city of Rome than Amanda. And that bit of knowing everything without the personal baggage of appearing like a know-all, which can be rather obnoxious, she was anything but that kind of persona, much missed. And I think I'm not the only person for whose life would be very different, in fact, if Amanda had not been around. The good news, especially for those of you on the course of the city of Rome, is that if one were to think, having said that Amanda is irreplaceable, if one were to think who might replace her, the name of Robert Coates-Stephens would come to mind. Robert asked me to give this lecture, and with some trepidation, I wanted to talk about Trajan's Column. There are quite a lot of good reasons for not wanting to talk about Trajan's Column. It was something that Amanda knew a lot about and published her thoughts on this. An awful lot that I'm afraid she didn't publish, but she did publish thoughts on Trajan's Column. And so, yeah, I'm going to dedicate this to her sweet memory. But with a trepidation that it's one of those monuments that is, you don't need me to tell you this, is very conspicuous. It has been, yeah, it's not like a revelation of modern times, but there's also a lot we don't know about it. There's an inscription on it that tells us that the column was raised to make a declaration, ad declarandum, and it refers to apparently a height of land that had to be cleared. So you've got 38 meters or so of column acting as the sort of calibration of some big public work that leveled the ground, but we're not quite sure what that ground was. That's an element of uncertainty. It's a tomb of Trajan and his wife, but nobody can say for certain if that's what the original intention of this monument was. it's not even clear that there was an original plan for it to have this helical band of relief going around it. And Amanda was one of those. In fact, this was really her main idea, I think, that she wanted to get out there published, was that it was Hadrian's column. The Trajan's successor, Hadrian, was the one who had the imagination to decorate a column with this spiral relief. Much excitement in the 1980s when it was being restored about whether it had been painted or not, but that's still a matter of unknown. And so you'd have to be something of a fool, really, to want to give a lecture about Trajan's column. Here goes. Why don't we try, as a sort of sample exercise of what I want to do in terms of rereading this as a piece of visual storytelling? Can we try just to work with what you can see from the ground, accepting that there are those scholars who for about a century or so have argued that it is possible in a way to read it vertically, so incompletely get these sort of vertical visions, and that those were thematically built into the design of the column. There are also some scholars who argue that you were never supposed to see it anyway, so don't worry about the fact that you can't see up the top. For various reasons, which will become, I hope, clearer as we go on, I think I want us to be able to, as it were, wind ourselves around it, and I think there are reasons why you can read it in that way. But let's, as a sample exercise, try to do something with one of the scenes that you can see from the ground. And if that's my pointer, Pepino, is that a point? Here we are, here we got it. Can you see, Dan, this is on the sort of north or northwest aspect of it. Can you see there's a figure who, this is a mule, and rather strangely, since he doesn't, like anyone in antiquity, they don't have stirrups, he's fallen, but he's sort of fallen backwards. I'm not sure how he did that, but obviously, I think, and one probably ought not to say obviously, but I'm going to say it regardless. Trajan, we're going to see him plenty of times, seems to be gesturing down to this figure. Yeah, we all buy into that, okay. Descriptions of the, I mean, there's handbooks of Trajan's column, the two best ones of recent publication, both in Italian, talk about the episode of the contadino caduto, the peasant who's fallen off his mule. And you may see here that there's a sort of lot of trumpeting. There's a sort of act of sacrifice and some loud trumpets, and it may be the noise of the trumpets that have caused the animal to throw the peasant off. We're going to need a slightly better view of what is happening here, because can I just get you to agree with me that he's not wearing any shoes? Yeah, and he's not wearing any trousers either, which is quite unusual in this part of the world. But I'll show you where we are in a moment, but you should be wearing trousers. And there's this thing which he almost appears to be holding on to. There's something in his hand, which is either a stick or possibly something else. Now, shortly after agreeing to do this lecture, started looking at some of these scenes in more detail and puzzling over the interpretations that have been given so far. Can we rule out one interpretation, and I can't even remember who offered this one, which is that the round object is a lump of cheese. I don't want to waste time as to why it's not a lump of cheese, but I'm going to rule that out. The go-to handbook of column scholars is a book by Conrad Chicorius in the late 19th century, which talks you through scene by scene. And Jacorius draws our attention to an episode which is known from, there's really just one textual source that we have for the column. And it's not a very promising one, although when I say it's written by a perfectly respectable Roman senator of Greek extraction called Cassius Dio, and it's part of his 80-volume history of Rome, you might think, this could be worth something. He's writing about a century after Trajan, but in fact, the bit that concerns Trajan's wars is very much abbreviated and incomplete, and we just got a sort of Byzantine compilation of extracts from that. But we seize upon whatever extracts we can make use of with this, and one of these extracts tells us that early on in the campaign, Trajan received a message from a tribe north of the area where he was he'd appeared. This was a message written in Latin, and it came, wait for it, on the back of a giant mushroom, a piece of enormous fungus. Again, let's try not to get diverted as to why you might want to send a message on the back of a piece of fungus. It doesn't seem like a way of sending a secret diplomatic message. And actually, this chap doesn't look like an ambassador sending a message, but Jacorius, if you look at Jacorius, there's a diagram where he shows you the underside of a large mushroom and suggests that there may be some element here that this is indeed that giant mushroom. And it may be that the sculptor was finding it as hard as we are finding it to visualize what this might be like. And having digested that and thrown away the cheese, what does this look like? And I looked up at the volume by Salvatore Settis, Contadina Caduto, where there's a theory that this is a prodigy, it's an omen. If it didn't actually happen, then it gets, se non è vero, ben trovato, it's made up for the point of view of Roman history. This happens to emperors on the eve of battles, that they see something which is an augury of good luck. And so it's taken to be an omen of victory. But Settis actually leaves it very much in the air as to what's happening with this round object. He doesn't want it to be a mushroom. And so this is just a peasant trotting along with the sort of things that peasants carry around. And in this case, some sort of sieve that you might use for sieving your grain. And I put it to you that it's got too much prominence just to be a piece of country impedimenta. And then I got this sort of, I get good thoughts usually at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I've just been reading something about artifacts appearing in the art market of Romania, which I'll show you in a moment. I know, I've got something to tell the people at the BSR. I've got a new interpretation. It's a sieve for panning gold. And the reason that he's got a short dress on and he hasn't got any shoes on is because we're being told he spends most of his time in the mountain streams of Dacia panning for gold. I'm going to use some of these drawings that I've fished out of the royal collections. And en passant, can I say that contrary to what some scholars, and John Coulston, if you're out there listening to this lecture remotely, peace be with you on this one, but there are those who say that the sculptors of Trajan's Column just worked freehand up the column. Any sculptor I've talked to said, you can't do that. You must have had a drawing, some model to go with. And it seems to me that these drawings made by an artist from Perugia called Pietro Bartoli, in a way, they kind of take us back to something like the models or the records that, I mean, there may have been artists with Trajan's army who made sketches in the field. Almost certainly there were images of the campaign that were paraded in triumph. And very likely these were stored in some library nearby to the column. So you could get this visual record from other sources. That's what a gold panning sieve looks like. And this is one that appears, it's with a bronze worker here, but it seems to me that this is what we have with our man, with this and its perforations. And I was feeling quite smug about this. You can guess what's coming next. yeah, someone around about 1999 published this idea in the Mélange Française of Rome, and he didn't quite follow it through, I think. And what's actually happened since Liliana Marinescu Nicolajsen has published this reading of scene 9 of the column, is that on the art market, a good number of these things started to appear around the turn of the millennium. They're substantial. Some of them are 1 or 2 kilos. They call them bracelets. They're more like armbands. And basically what was happening after the downfall of communism in Romania was that this site and a series of sites and broadly the area is Transylvania, which most people these days associate with vampires. The Trajans Column is going to take us to another aspect of this area, which was the capital and sort of head sanctuary of Dacia, as Dacia had been united under a king called Decabalus. Decabalus had seen off, I think Domitian sent 6 armies to try him out in 87 CE. Prodigiously rich. And from this site, which as you can see is it's not densely populated, but there were these reports that a lot of people with metal detectors were active in and around this area and digging up these things. And that in that sense, these objects would be sort of like he's fallen from his horse. He's, as it were, just an amateur gold panner. He's seen the future, this poor old peasant, and that's the future. And it's a future in which the gold mines and the silver mines of this area will belong to the Roman emperor, and there will be a procurator horariarum, someone who is in charge of gold mining in this area. And that's not to mention all of the, tons and tons of gold and silver are reportedly were brought back by Trajan from these campaigns. So you could see this as a kind of, the jargon word be proleptic. It is looking, it's not just an omen of Trajan's victory. If you take this to be a gold panning sieve, it is the transfer of that activity, that mineral resource to the Romans. And one of the fascinating aspects, and rather, it can be rather one of the unsettling aspects of looking at Trajan's Column, is that as a narrative, it's not definitive. It's possible to read this, wait for it, in a post-colonialist way. It is possible to read Trajan's Column as not just a land grab by the Romans, but a personal mission by an emperor to enrich himself at the expense of neighbors who had seen off one emperor now disgraced, and this offered. The column does not give an account of why the war started. In fact, as you know, it's 2 campaigns that are referred to on this. where it's all happening, this action, because I realized that this may not be everyone's general knowledge. It certainly didn't used to be part of mine, but this is the part. I mean, Romania has only existed as a nation state really relatively recently. The colony that Trajan established after his victory is about 40 kilometers south of the site, Sarmizegetuza here. And this is where the gold and silver mines were. But these enormous bracelets have been turning up in rather large numbers, implying that quite a lot of the Dacian treasure was not recovered by the Romans. It was successfully buried in these forests. The column makes no secret of the transfer of wealth, or rather the area, monumental area surrounding the column makes no secret of it. And as you get it from Aulus Gellius, I mean, Ammianus Marcellinus says, forget everything else about ancient Rome. The place to see is Trajan's Forum. Of all the mirabilia in Rome, that is the most amazing place of all. And as he says, ex manubius was repeatedly, this was all of this that you see, the libraries, the basilica, etc. It's from the spoils of war. And it seems that part of the forum was paid for, as it were, from state booty, partly by Trajan's personal wealth. The two sort of must have allied to some extent. But that's the message broadcast all around the column. Now I'm going to do a little bit of jargon peddling with you. There are whole dictionaries of this activity, narratology. And there are things called distributed narratives. Does anyone know what a distributed narrative is? Thank you, Robert, for shaking your head. A distributed narrative is where you pick up the story in different areas of space. So if you had a story, as it were, on a column, you might also pick the story up elsewhere. And it was a story, this is a story that is actually quite difficult to miss anywhere in the Trajans Forum area. Every time you pull out your your purse to pay for something, the coins are telling you what has happened to Dacia as a captive area. There are these statues, so something like 48 or 50 of these have survived, and some of them are big, they're over life size, these figures of captive Dacians. And again, I think just dwelling on what these look like individually can be instructive. If I'd said to you, this is an image of some distinguished cynic philosopher, cynic with a capital C, i.e. a respectable, card-carrying Greek cynic, admittedly a physically rather powerful one for a philosopher, you could be forgiven for swallowing that suggestion. It's a face that is, I mean, this is supposed to be a captive, but it's a captive who has a presence and a demeanor that is striking. And I think it's a figure, one of many figures, that invite the viewer to ask, well, what's their story? Yeah. It's somehow both abject, and it's supposed to be a captive with the chains holding its wrists together. And yet it's got this dignity about it that I think draws in our curiosity. We don't know where exactly this image comes from. It found its way onto the Arch of Constantine. But let me remind you, if you knew already, if we tell you if you don't, Trajan, like so many Romans, had a sort of parallel life, and his ideal opposite number, if you like, his role model is Alexander. That's was fairly well known in antiquity. It's possible to read the column as Trajan's ego trip. He appears almost 60 times on it. You don't actually see him in action in battle, which I think is quite a significant element, but you will pick up images of him leading a cavalry charge elsewhere in this distribution of narrative. And it's all telling us that, like Alexander, he engaged with the fighting. But there is this question about the column: who is telling the story? And most of the handbooks about it will tell you it must be based on Trajan's own commentaries. We know they existed on his Dacian wars. And since it's very likely those were deposited in a library nearby, I think we have to accept that the column and those commentaries are not essentially dissonant. They will not contradict each other. They may not be the same, but they won't contradict each other. And so you could be sort of thinking, well, yes, the question, whose authority is the column, must be Trajan. It can't be anything else. But it isn't as simple as that. And if you go into the world of narrative studies and even just engaging with sort of school level stuff of kids who are analyzing how stories get told and how to read them accordingly, you'll find yourself confronted by this kind of diagram and being asked to sort of locate a narrator. And that's one thing you can't do with a column. You can't locate a narrator. Most scholars follow Bianchi Bandinelli, great Italian archaeologist, art historian, who concocted the idea of a maestro, always a good thing to concoct in Italy, a maestro of the imprese di Trajano, someone who will just, you know, assume overall artistic control. But this is a fiction of, you know, scholars really being unable to accept that you couldn't have a void, a vacuum of some overall director of this. There must be someone in charge of the whole thing. But we have no idea who that person was. Sometimes it's Trajan's architect, Apollodorus is given credit for it, but there's no proof of this at all. And in a sense, it's not the right question to be asking, because people who analyze the way that stories are told by cinema will tell you that impersonal narration really is the rule with cinema. And it's quite unusual of a film to ask who's telling the story, because so many, you know, look at the film credits and just we realize just how many different creative minds are at work with a film. It's going to be something a bit more like that going on with the column, possibly. I mean, the column has been you know, held up as an example of proto-cinema several times, and it was much admired actually by Sergei Eisenstein as a sort of, you know, this is how montage is done. This is how you do your cutaways, get your wide angle shots, your close-up. There's a mixture of all of these things. And actually this variety of perspective in the column is what makes it such a rewarding read. And having been nervous about tackling, you know, the issue of what is the story of Trajan's Column, I began to get a little bit bolder about it. I think you have to accept that it is, I mean, Trajan's going to win this. Yeah, it's an elogium, it is a praise song for Trajan, whether he intended it or whether his adoptive successor Hadrian did it for him, as Amanda liked to think. Trajan is guiding this, and there's no getting away from that. I like this scene where you can just imagine this happening, where some dignitary, state dignitary, is allowed to take control of something for a bit. I remember in the Boris Johnson's last campaign, someone let him loose on a sort of forklift truck, and took it away from him very quickly. But there you see Trajan as the helmsman. He's at the ship of state. He is guiding things, and there's no getting away from that. This is not the same as saying he is the one who is telling this story. We have only one line of his station commentaries, and it's quoted by one of the first people to write a Latin grammar book, and it's all to do with how you form the nominative case of certain strange place names. So it's not very illuminating. It simply says, we went to one place and then we went to another place. That's all this line says. So it's not exactly a sort of great strategic insight. So in a sense, I'm going to make references, as I already have, to a sort of paratext that is offered by Dio Cassius in his account of what Trajan did in Dacia. But I think the ground rule for us trying to read this as a narrative is to accept, if you will, a syllogism. And this, if you've done any philosophy, you'll know how a syllogism works. But I'm just going to read this out as something to go with a series of logical steps. That the designer of Trajan's Column worked in a classical Hellenistic tradition of representing war stories. Now, there is such a tradition as a man called Felix Pearson, who used to be at Cambridge. His whole PhD was about the Bildsprache, the way that views of war appear all around the Mediterranean and the classical world in a certain way. And nearly all of them, whether they're mythological or on the tombstones of old soldiers, are not documentary. That's quite an important thing to take on board. Felix Pearson doesn't explicitly say this, but I would go further and make the next step of the syllogism, that the tradition of representing war stories is fundamentally informed by the visual transmission of Homeric epic. So basically, it's all going back to the Iliad as a visual tradition. And therefore, you get to step 3 of the syllogism. Trajan's Column is fundamentally informed by Homeric epic. Can I just run by you some examples of where one might go with this? And I've been told to switch myself off at about 7 o'clock, so we do have some time to talk about these possibilities. There are, through the column, a series of what you might call narrative stimuli. That is to say, accepting that a lot of it, as many scholars have pointed out, a lot of it is formulaic. The scenes of marching, the camp building, the scenes of speeches, the scenes of sacrifice, there's a pattern to these and they get repeated, and to some extent, I'm going to say one glazes over, but you recognize that these are formulas for all the sort of necessary backstory, if you like, of the campaign. And then there are these so-called hapax scenes, hapax being the Greek for one-off, scenes where there are about a dozen of these on the column, which have don't fit with the formulaic run of what's being presented. And I just want to look at a few of these and see whether the resonances they have had with me are ones that you might share as well. And I've put in just 1 or 2 episodes of current photojournalism. I'm not going to say anything about this, but let them do their own sort of works. If there's time at the end, I want to say something about one of these photojournalists, a man called Don McCullin, who's still around, and how he fits into all of this. But a scene where Trajan, still in his gubernator mode, has a group of women with babies around. One of them seems to be getting, there's a direct, and what that gesture means is, it's usually taken to be, yes, you get on that boat. You're with us now. Some have suggested this is the king's sister, Decabalus's sister, but we know nothing more about her. Already it seems to me that if I'm claiming there's a vein of Homeric epic about this, I mean, the very origin of war, as it's related by the Iliad, or the very origin of the wrath of Achilles, who gets possession of the women, in this man's world of war? And there you are, it's already sort of part of this narrative. And it's one of these tropes of intimacy, or moments of intimacy that you see in the column. That it's not very hard to find visual parallels for what it is that image makers of war are trying to tell us about soldiers who are in the business of dealing with death, but get pictured in the moment of trying to assist in the preservation of life and the future generation of life. Basically, I think the message of the column, with other scenes where women are gathered around Trajan, is that attend his sacrifices, do as he tells you, and you've chosen the right guy to be with. I mean, incidentally, all of this, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, that the sort of reputation of Trajan, by the time that Dio Cassius was writing, it was already established, to put it bluntly, that he was one of the good guys. It's going to get more complicated. I can see people in the audience. I'm looking at you, Rosamond. You can tell us the name of the Pope who shed tears as he was walking through Trajan's column, because he heard the story of how Trajan dealt justice to a poor old widow and thereby baptized Trajan. And in Dante's Purgatorio, he's there as one of the models of the, Trajan stands for justice. So this idea that he's a reckless Alexander charging into the enemy is tempered in this way. But we're going to look at some more of these scenes. And when this one is shown, it's sometimes called the Battle of the Bandages. And we reach out again to Dio Cassius, who tells us that at one of the major early encounters with the Dacians, I mean, they'd seen off 6 legions sent by Domitian. They were very formidable, well-organized fighting force. Nowhere on the column will you see a Roman fatality, which you may be thinking stretches credulity, but you will see them being tended to. There are those scholars, Ian Richmond, one of the names that appears on the bibliography, who published a monograph with the BSR, Trajan's Army on Trajan's Column, and he will label this as field dressing station. Now, as you see, there are no structures here to indicate that this is actually these are paramedics at work. And in fact, these figures are not dressed any differently from the others around them. They're often identified as paramedics, but in fact, as you see, they're carrying weapons themselves. At this Battle of the Bandages, they ran out of bandages, and the story was that Trajan started ripping up his own cloak to provide bandages for the troops. And if that happened, we don't see him doing it here. What are we left with? Well, we're left with some legionaries and auxiliaries basically looking after each other. And if this reminds you of anything, I mean, perhaps this is because I spend most of my time talking about Greek vases, certainly did when I did my book on the Sarpedon Krater. The image of Achilles and Patroclus is what comes to me when I look at that scene of bandages. And that in itself is carrying quite a lot of emotional baggage. Now, the word empathy was in my title, and there is a discipline that is known as Neuro art history. Have any of you come across the work of somebody called Vittorio Gallese, who is a neurologist who's done a lot of work on mirror neurons and the automatic reflexes that we have that generate empathy. His theory is that we are all hardwired for our bodies to respond. If we see someone else being injured, we wince. This is the roots of empathy. And as Gallese has pointed out, this has big implications for how we look at images and how we do art history. And so when we see injuries, when we see displays of emotion, affection, and so on, we are, as it were, involved in them as a reflex. And this is quite different in terms of accepting a story through images than it would be to read about it in a text or to hear it described, however vivid the language. It's that visual process, and mirror neurons, they've been used in rehabilitation, to get people to use their limbs again if they've been badly injured. They need to see someone moving, and their brain will start generating the same movements back. And yeah, as I say, I think this has profound implications for how we read images. And there are some here that I want to draw our attention to. No one, so far as I know, has commented on what's going on here. I mean, at first sight, it looks like a snog, if you pardon the language. But it's in the context of after a battle, and it's in the context of Trajan receiving his own soldiers. One of them's going off with a sack on his back. These ones are sort of looking up to the emperor as if in applause. And these two, this is where the sort of emotional carryover from Achilles and Patroclus comes in. And to me, it's saying something very, very powerful about the Roman way of fighting. And whereas a military historian, someone like Ian Richmond, will be looking at how they lock their shields together to form the testudo and all this kind of thing, that cultural recall of Achilles and Patroclus is a different kind of bond. And it's the bond that united, for example, the sacred band of Thebes, who fought together and were such an effective fighting force because basically they were all partnered up. The suggestion there is possibly that in Trajan's forces, he has this kind of loyalty prevailing among his troops, although that's not the entire story, as you'll see in a moment. Now, juxtaposed to this is a cutaway. There's Trajan, and there's something going on here which our mirror neurons will tell us is painful. So there are apparently female figures holding torches, grabbing three men who've been stripped. How much facial hair these men have is not entirely clear. Because they haven't got any clothes on, it's rather difficult to identify who they are. The handbooks, Filippo Coarelli's Cetis, just have laconically Roman prisoners being tortured by Dacian women. And presumably the reading then is that this is an atrocity committed by the Dacians, which is some justification for going on with the war. Dio tells us, now Dio's role as a sort of source in a sort of paratextual way for this story is interesting, because he tells us that Trajan was a heavy drinker, another, Alexander Trajan imitation element. He tells us that Trajan was a pederast, he liked boys around him. And he sort of adds, but these were venial sins. These were failings that did not impair his abilities as an emperor. He also tells us that Trajan was very accessible. Now, this is similarly, Alexander and Philip before him prided themselves on anyone could get an audience with them, yeah, if they badgered them hard. And what you see either side of this scene is that Trajan is receiving some kind of embassy or entourage here, and there again he's doing it. Now, if we get ourselves into impersonal narration, cinematic mode, we've got a cutaway in the middle of this scene where our mirror neurons tell us that whatever's going on here, it is torture. Yeah, it's something painful is happening to these three guys who've got their hands tied behind them. And when Dio tells us in this sort of element, this filament of candor that you get here, he tells us that deserters were quite a big problem with the Roman force, and that Decabalus capitalized on this. And at one point in the Second Dacian War, Decabalus got some Roman deserters to use Trajan's accessibility and exploit it and do away with Trajan. Suspicions were aroused when they arrived, and under torture, one of them confessed that they had been sent by Decabalus to assassinate Trajan. Now, that's working with just that sort of little snippet of information from Dio, but when it's framed with Trajan receiving people, receiving them again, and it seems to me that narrative in that montage makes a lot more sense, read as this is what happened to some deserters who got caught abusing Trajan's accessibility. Now, what about Decabalus? Decabalus, if you've been along the Danube, you will know he is not just a national hero of Romania, modern Romania, he is the national hero of modern Romania. And he is a hero whose narrative, I have to confess, I have not seen Romanian films that celebrate the life of Decabalus, but they exist. The Romanian story of what he did against Trajan is there if you want it. What about the column and what it tells us? I mean, he's pretty much recognizable. He appears about half a dozen times on the column. It may be that one of these captive Dacians has particular portrait features that we can associate with him. But just look at the way in which, I think this is his first appearance in the column, where he's disembodied. He's just a head. It's almost like he's from, you know, the side of a coin. And we find him in a forest. This is one of the windows for the getting light into the spiral staircase within this. And we see his sight line. Now, in narratological terms, what Decabalus is here is not a narrator, he's what they call a focalizer. He is focalizing the viewer's gaze to look at where he's looking. What do we see? Well, we see Dacians in trouble. We can't be telepathic to his mind. But what the artist can do is indicate by juxtaposition, as it were, how to read his expression, and using, in this sense, not just our mirror neurons, but using what a whole school of another art historical school, you know, the school of Abby Warburg of Aarburg, and the study of how iconography can contain formulaic generators of pathos. Warburg would have seen this figure immediately below Decabalus. He's young, he's got very luxuriant hair. It looks almost like his face is an expression of a blissful sleep. But with two figures bearing him away, it can only mean one thing, apart from a body taken from the battlefield. And it can only, in a sense, generate one response in the viewer. And Italo Calvino, in his little essay on Trajans Column, put his finger on it, that this image is an appeal that transcends the documentary, any kind of documentary or historical sense that these are Romans against barbarians. This is the loss of a young man, and he's being carried off. He's got a family, and you know, they're going to receive the body, and as Calvino puts it, it's the story of many a deposition. I think, I mean, I'd be inclined on the basis of previous work to go a little bit further back than these images, which, as Warburg amply demonstrated, can transfer from pagan to Christian without any problem, to be used by Raphael and others from Roman sarcophagi. But take the story back to Homeric epic, and you have this is the prime founding image of the beautiful death of a young man with long hair and being carried off in Homeric terms for eternal glory. But we're supposed to feel sad about it. It's a pathos formula. And likewise, to say that there are no Roman fatalities here, but no shortage of Dacian ones. And the way in which they have been done is, in certain instances, calculated to invite an empathetic response from the viewer that says, I'm sorry to see that happening. And you will get, as we'll see in a moment, we get Decabalus looking on at this, as it were, mirroring our own story. Now, as with all stories of this sort, there is truth from one perspective and a kind of partisan scholarship operating with this. So, for example, on one of the scenes, as we're now sort of moving towards the top of the column and stopping at these so-called hapax moments, these narrative stimuli, where, as you see here, the Dacians now have taken a lot of punishment from the Romans. They've been under siege, and there is a figure here who's drawing something from a pot. In, I think, all of the Italian and Anglophone handbooks of late, this is a terrible sight. It is mass suicide by the Dacians, and the content of the pot is poison, which figures are taking and then holding their stomachs in agony as they collapse all around. Go to a Romanian historian's account of this, and it's much more, I mean, depending on your attitude, let's say, towards the act of suicide, but if it's regarded as something disgraceful, as presumably is the case with this particular Romanian historian, he says it's been misinterpreted. This is not the distribution of poison. These are Dacian nobles who are down to their last drops of water. And this is the justice right to the end, that someone is doling out the last drops of water to them. So if your perspective is nationalistic, you are going to read these things. But as I say, these lines of vision are important, and the kind of emotional register on the face of Decabalus gets more and more intense as we go along. And as things are beginning to look dark for him, there was a French scholar called Alain Malissard who went through the column looking at all its cinematic elements, and he picked on this one here as an example of how the designers of the column couldn't work with the historical narrative as it had been sort of presented to them as a script, and they collapsed things out of space and time. Those of you who know about Homeric narration and the Homeric narrator may be aware that when Homer is telling a story, he's not just Homer. He is a super narrator. He can be anywhere he likes in space or time. He can do wide angle, he can do close up, and he's with the muses. And I think we have to think of our maestro of this column working similarly. And in that case, perhaps this is not such a violation of sequence. Alain Malissard thought that what we see here are Roman legionaries who are loading bits of treasure onto horses. And according to Cassius Dio, this happens after the death of Decabalus. He hasn't died yet. Malissard's explanation is that this has had to be moved forward because it might be a bit embarrassing if it happened after the death of Decabalus, because it would imply that that's all that Trajan was interested in, getting the hundreds of tons of gold and all those precious objects, which, by the way, there's a sort of folktale narrative about that being hidden under a river by Decabalus, and then that hiding place being betrayed later on by one of his own associates, which is suspiciously generic. It's what happens with the treasure of Alaric and others. But this segues into that horse, which I think was probably associated with the collecting of the booty, is providing a segue into the chase for Decabalus, and the leader is going to be seen here. This is his last appeal to his followers. They're all looking at him, but there's really not much they can do. And this horse is sort of already anticipating the chase of the king, and it's going to end with his suicide. And I don't think any Romanian historian has challenged that bit of the narrative. Decabalus does put an end to himself. It becomes a heroic end. Rather than being captured, he will do this. And you see him here. Just note his scale. He's before he dies, he's sort of become a giant. He's about 2/3 the size extra of the figures around him, and he's holding up a characteristic weapon of the Dacian nobility. You can look at this from various angles and see different things in it. I went up the column when it had scaffolding all around it, and it was Amanda Claridge who took us up. It was a very fragile state at that time, and visibly kind of the acid rain was doing its damage. But when I took this image of the face of Decabalus, it struck me then, and it struck me since I dug out these old photographs. By the way, I don't know if British School still has its dark room. It's where it's now called a snack bar, but I remember developing this image in that very dark room and being momentarily transfixed by it, because I think it's actually just the force of the erosion, but it struck me that the effect on us is to see someone who has actually not looking at anything in particular. He's completely turned in on himself. And in this remaining 5 minutes of my talk, I'm going to throw in some Latin tags here, which you've got one here. I can't prove that this is what is being said by the column, but I can, I think, transmit this sense that there is a stoic sort of honor being played out by Decabalus, who has been hunted down into a position. Just look at the gesture of the soldier who's, his arm is coming forward, basically, to try and prevent the act of suicide. Not that long ago, a tombstone was found near Philippi, allegedly of the soldier who caught Decabalus and presented his head taken away from the body on a shield to Trajan, and you see that later on in the column, that Decabalus does the damage to himself. And seeing him almost absorbed in this, absorbed in himself, reminded me of this famous advice from Seneca, about the way to liberty. There's just one way. There's one thing you can do when everything is taken away from you. There's one thing they can't do, is prevent you from taking your own way to freedom. And it's that libertas that keys in, I think, with this. And this is what Decabalus is celebrated as a freedom fighter. And interestingly, also in antiquity, you can find Dio Chrysostom, who may have had some paternal relationship with Dio Cassius, wrote an oration in which Eleutheria, freedom, is what Decabalus was fighting for. It looks like his children were ushered away to, one dreads to think what their fate was. But at the end of the column, I mean, there it is in the middle of Rome, as if it were part of a triumphal thing. But the narrative of the column doesn't take us back to Rome. And it's a moot point as to whether all these Dacian captives are standing in as surrogates for an absence of captives actually brought back. If they've all done themselves to death or been done to death by the Romans, then it may be that Trajan did not have a great entourage of Dacians to parade in triumph in Rome. So the marble effigies, if you like, are standing in for them. But the column goes its own way. It's rather eroded, more seriously eroded towards the end. But you can still pick out what is happening. And it's a kind of coda with a very elegiac, but not totally doom-laden ending. The image of civilians, and they've not got the caps. You notice the image of Decabalus and his sort of main warrior comrades. They've got these sort of, they're not caps as such, but they're called the pileus is the Latin name for them, sort of peaked cap, a sign of nobility and warrior status in Dacia. These civilians don't have that. But the children riding on the shoulders, the old people going along, you are, I think, being taken back to the archetypal disaster. Simone Weil used to say this. She wrote this in Paris in the time of the taking of Paris in the 1940s, and how the Iliad prefigured that, the fall of Troy. The Romans knew this. This was circulated as an epitome of their own radical origins, that they'd been basically refugees from a war zone. And this is what you get on the end of the column. And I couldn't resist fishing out this line from Virgil's account, his plangent account of how Troy fell and how bands of people basically picked up what they could, the most precious things they had, and started to move away. A miserabile vulgus, these, a miserable looking lot, and certainly one wouldn't want to, as it were, exchange places with people in this situation. But the tapering of the column, in cinematic terms, you might think of it as a fade, as an ending. Look what you get as it goes up to the top. Actually, the humans, the refugees, get left behind. They're being ushered away to, I mean, this is going to be colonized by the veterans of the legions. I can't remember how many legions Trajan left in Dacia, but certainly it needed a presence of legionaries, and partly as the colonizing force of it. So these are Dacians, indigenous people, who are being moved out to who knows where they have to go. And they are preceded by some livestock. They've been allowed to take away the livestock. And the last image, in fact, of the column is of a goat just stooping to nibble some green shoots right at the end. And as Virgil would have it, Justissima tellus, the justice of the earth provides the food that is essentially a regenerative act of some kind of hope, very slender hope, and it's slendering visibly at the top of the column. So our journey to the top is concluding there. Amanda Claridge expressed in, I think it was her review of Filippo Coarelli's book on the column, those two didn't see eye to eye. Whether Filippo sees eye to eye with anyone is a moot point. Just remember this is being recorded. Let me shut up about that. Amanda expressed the hope that there would be a revolution in the approaches to the column and that we wouldn't be fixated about matters of military history and such like. So I hope this has gone some way to satisfying that express wish of hers. I wanted to end with what I think is a particularly illuminating general observation about narrative. Because so often at a sort of undergraduate level, and I've been guilty of this myself, talking about Trajan's Column, it's imperial propaganda. And of course, what that's doing is demeaning it. And it's suggesting that basically you don't need to look at it. You know what's going to happen. You know the Romans are going to win. And it's basically saying it's boring. And if I try to do anything this evening, it's to say it repays, these scenes repay a reading that is open to the emotional reflexes of the narrative considered as a war story. Don McCullin, I promise I'm going to stop soon, but Don McCullin, the photojournalist who amazingly lived through the wars that he documented, in his old age, living in rural Somerset, has become rather fatalistic. You know, he said, what was I trying to do with my photos? I was trying to show what war is really like. You do one campaign of photojournalism, and what happens? Another war starts, and you sort of feel, well, what was the point? Bit of an element of that here, but I think at the level of projecting it as a story, this quote, and it's from a narrative expert called Gerald Prince, who states, reading a narrative is waiting for the end of a story. And the quality of that waiting is the quality of the narrative. And I think in Trajan's Column, it's worth looking at it precisely for the quality of its storytelling.
Well, I think we'll all want to thank Nigel for this incredibly rich and thought-provoking analysis, reminding us never to stop looking at monuments we think we know, but a narrative that's also carried us out of Rome, beyond the frontiers, into ancient Dacia, but also more contemporary theatres of war, all supported with the quality of images that the discussion needed. So there's a great deal to discuss here, and we already have questions from our online audience, and I'm sure we'll have some more from the floor here. Maybe I could start with one. Going back above all to your title and your main theme, which is empathy. You've said quite a lot about empathy, but it strikes me an awful lot of the empathy was what we find as modern viewers. And I wondered, there's two kind of questions that are linked to the same thing. One is, how much empathy could we expect from Roman viewers, people whose prime entertainment was watching people being butchered and tortured to death in an amphitheatre for entertainment? And the other question, which links to it really, is, do we only see empathy in art but not in life? And if so, why?
Do I stand here while I talk to you this answer?
Whatever.
I don't know what works best, but it does seem a bit kind of peculiar to do this. I mean, the question of what counts as empathy is close to the question of to what extent pity was an emotion that had a particular register in antiquity. That is to say, before it was such a substantial part of Christian doctrine. I mean, one can quote episodes like the reaction to when in Pompey's show he had a lot of elephants put to death, and the sight of the elephants groaning and sort of sagging to their knees just got the crowd totally turned against the impresario and feeling empathy for the animals. I mean, I think that trope of Roman crowds enjoying blood is actually much disputed by historians, the extent to which that actually gave gratification. But it seems to me that the narrative here, the risk, the Roman rhetoricians, Quintilian, such like, they knew about the importance of a sequence, a build-up of things, and about people getting psychologically engaged in something. You know, they had these techniques of, for example, the captatio benevolentia. You start off your speech in such a way that gets the audience on your side. You've got to have moments, and you know, they would use that Latin term, turning points where things happen that bring you in. And if you think of this, just think you are the maestro of the imprese di Trajan, of Trajan's things. Especially if you're doing this at a bit of a distance. I mean, let's go with either Amanda's idea that it's Hadrian who's putting this up for Trajan, or that it's, you know, it becomes a tomb for Trajan, and you know, a lot of this is not part of his original sort of vision of the column. Your narrative instinct is to make it interesting, that quality of waiting for the end. You've got to, so I think if you don't have those feelings for the Dacians, who, as I say, that they're not treated with contempt in any part of the narrative. And even if you read that scene of the Dacian nobleman handing out poison, you know, that there are ways of reading that as an honourable thing to do, and not just in a Stoic way. That's, you know, the Roman stories of a Spartan boy who's about to be captured, you know, literally fracturing his skull against the wall and crying out, "Non serviam, I am not going to be a slave, I'd rather." Yeah. And I think Romans, you know, it may not be what we call pity, but it's very close to it. And if you go with Vittorio Gallese, that empathy response is, it's trans-historical, it's cross-cultural, and it's biological. And if you don't have it, it's called neural divergence, and it's counted in my university as a disability. You have to, you know, seek help to get this again.
Maybe that explains what the problem with the Romans was. They needed to seek help. So we've got lots of questions here, some from the students as well. So let's start with one of our students, Lucas.
Cheers, thanks for this amazing talk. I especially found your new identification of that circular object very convincing. A gold panning sieve sounds better than a piece of cheese. Thanks for that.
Swiss cheese with holes in it.
Sorry?
Swiss cheese.
Oh, Swiss cheese. Oh, yeah, that's where the holes come from. Oh, yeah, now that makes sense. I did, however, wonder about scene 45, the torture scene. And you said that perhaps it might be linked to Cassius Dio reporting that some Roman traitors were sent by Decabalus to kill Trajan. But I do wonder if indeed they were Roman traitors and they were sort of intercepted on the way sneaking into Trajan's tent. Why would you have clearly non-Roman women carrying out the torture? And I think a much more convincing reading for that scene would be that Trajan sort of had handed over some of his Dacian captives to local women on the Roman side of the Danube to sort of have their retaliation for past Dacian incursions, which would fit in well with the scene next to it, which is a departure scene. Trajan says goodbye to his auxiliaries, paying them off, settling the scores, so to speak. And then the next scene on, he gets on a boat and leaves. So I think perhaps the Mysian women of Mysia Inferior getting their retaliation would be another instance of Trajan's justice instead of Roman traitors being penalized.
Yeah.
I wondered what you thought about that. Cheers.
I mean, the trepidation of doing an exercise like this is that because it's not a definitive narrative, it's, as it were, it is a matter of perspective. And I guess one of my sort of grounding angles on this is that it's, Dio's account, what we have of it, is not what I would call a whitewash. And if he's telling us about the problem of, what's the Greek word, automolia, I think it is, desertion in Trajan's army. I mean, if you were the maestro and working strictly according to, Trajan wants this, I mean, you could imagine the scenario, says, but don't tell him about that. My troops are all absolutely loyal to me. But if it becomes, as it were, a narrative in which it's possible for these desertion, I mean, it happens in armies, and you can see how it would happen. Then the column does us a favor as viewers of it by allowing that possibility of reading. I agree with you that why should this torture? And Dio mentions, again, I don't know what the Greek is, but it's as a result of torture that the plot is discovered. But it just seemed to me that from a sort of film directorial point of view, if that scene is flanked by two scenes of Trajan engaging with, as it were, visitors, and not kind of locking himself away, it may have something to do with that, but I can't prove it.
Harry?
Thank you. I just had some thoughts on the scenes of the dying young Dacians, and kind of as a parallel to deaths in war in general. I was wondering, because it seems to me that it could be a way to express the Roman casualties, that even though they don't want to acknowledge openly, they are kind of celebrating their dead with the analogy of the enemy. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and if that could tie into the general lack of contempt you see towards the Dacians, because they use them as a way to talk about their own experiences of war that they don't want to openly admit.
Yeah, I mean, the military experts go into some detail about the extent to which auxiliaries and foreign recruits are being deployed in these actions. And there are scenes which you may be aware of decapitation and the heads being sort of flourished to the emperor, where it's very clear that it's not Roman legionaries doing this. I mean, notoriously, there's an explanation, for example, of Hadrian's War, that the legionaries that did that because they'd much rather build a wall than fight. And you see them plenty of times. They've got their helmets and their weapons not far away, but they're doing their bricklaying. And so you can break the column down in that way, as if what it's saying to the Roman viewers is Trajan he values the lives of his legionaries, and arguably he values them. They don't cut off the enemy's head. That's what these auxiliaries who are from, I mean, Dacia, that area, has a complex sort of tribal story behind it, and it's not clear that Decabalus can count on all his neighbors to support him. So there are those elements too. I'm not sure if that's answered your question, however.
No, it was along those lines, but just more focused on those scenes of the dying nations being carried away with Decabalus looking on above. Is just an allegory for Roman casualties that, as you said, they didn't show any.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to, representations on Greek vases of the Trojan battlefield, where it's very difficult to point to Greek viewers taking any kind of satisfaction in Trojan casualties. And I don't think the readers of Homer have that on, that's not on their mind as a factor of, whose side, and in the sense they just become dreadful casualties, whether they're Dacian or Romans or auxiliaries. Yeah.
We've got 2 more questions from the floor.
Thanks so much for a really wonderful and illuminating lecture. My question was to pick up on your point about narrative, and I'm an early modern historian, so so for me, these both columns, Trajans and Marcus Aurelius, are sort of combined with the statues that Sixtus V puts up on them, and you showed the very final end of the image. Was it before Sixtus V? Was it always was that the end? Because it just sort of seems that with Trajan's column, if he's buried there and you have this massive column, was there never a statue of Trajan on top of it? And if so, was Trajan not really the end of the story? I'm just sort of like, rather than this fade to black, I'm just thinking, what happens after this series of images ends? Because I think that would be, it's no longer there because now it's St. Peter. And I think that's why Sixtus V put him there, because then Christianity is the end. But I'm wondering if there is before that, if there's any written evidence or if we know anything about what was on top of that column, if there was anything on top of that column, and how that would complicate, your point about narrative.
That's a very interesting question. There were things on the top of the column before Peter got put on there. And there was a colossal image of Trajan. All around the forum, there were lots of big images of Trajan. But at some point, and I bet the man on my left knows this, there was an owl on the top. At least that's the case on some coins. On the coin, yeah. Which would be indicative, presumably, of Trajan's. What does the owl signify? Wisdom, and the library, the juxtaposition of library space around it. But you're right, yeah. There is something on top of the column which arguably overrides everything. Trajan, I think explicitly, I may be wrong, but I think he explicitly reckoned on following Alexander's epithet of invictus. No one beats him. And semper invictus, always unconquered. Would him at the top would be, yes, the sort of seal of that narrative.
We've got, before we have the last question from the floor, there's one from the online audience from Andrew Hazefinkel, who says, thank you for your generous and engaging lecture. Please excuse my relative ignorance of the chronology of the Dacian campaigns. My question revolves around the close relationship between Trajan and his sister Marciana, who frequently accompanied him on campaigns following the death of her husband. I'm wondering if we have any record, direct or indirect, of Marciana's presence on the Dacian campaigns, and if we do, what, if any, implications this may have had on potentially distributed authorship of the telling of the story played out upon the column.
I don't know the answer. Certain individuals have been identified. Young Hadrian as the commander of one of the legions. Another close sort of adjutant officer. But I'm not aware of Trajan's sister. I think it would be quite unusual to have her. I mean, I think it's unusual for the emperor to play such a big role, and it's most historians' consensus that you know it's in opposition to Domitian that Trajan is so much of a participant. You know, he's there in the front, and if not actually fighting in the battle, it's very close to the action.
I think it's more about the authorship. But
Right.
John Coulston's just reminded us that the owl coins are 17th century forgeries.
Oh.
All the ancient representations of Trajan and bronze fragments were recorded in the Renaissance since last. Yes, those were the feet. C9, C so we have.
Yes, thank you for the interesting lecture. About the scene, the 45 scene that you have shown about the women with the torches, I just want to stress that one of the two prisoners is depicted with the beard and mustache. It's a bearded man with mustache.
Yeah.
So in the other one does not have any kind of this representation. So it is possible that these two images are referring symbolically to two different types of warriors, maybe one more near to the indigenous people of Dacia, maybe that, as you said, was maybe tried to assassinate the princeps, but it is also to highlight that the war is never black and white. It's always a shade of gray, showing that it's not always we are the good and they are the bad, but there are always people which are near the border. So maybe some Dacians which sided with the princeps, or some like this, and this it's like related to the chaotic nature of war. So it's now we, as archaeologists, as historian, usually we oversimplify. So these are the goods, these are the bads, and that's all. But we know from the sources and also from the images that it's never so simple to distinguish so clearly the fighters, the combatants, and the parties that are in the.
No, I very much agree with that, and it's completely out of the historical context. But I think that one of the best descriptions of war by Stendhal, the Battle of Waterloo, where he just conjures up a whole mass of soldiers, and they don't know which side they're supposed to be on, and who's the enemy, who's the friend, and a lot of that must have happened. But I've looked closely at the facial hair of those three figures, and it's not easy to determine that. The bodies are those of athletes. I mean, that's one thing that's clear.
Okay, well, I think on that note of agreement, we'll give Nigel a break and a drink, and thank him once more, as well as our online audience, for this very fitting homage to the late lamented Amanda Claridge. Thank you very much.